Good morning, and thank you for joining us. We at the Soufan Center are delighted to host this webinar today for a timely and critical discussion of foreign fighters, volunteers, and mercenaries, parsing non-state actors in the Ukraine-Russia conflict. My name is Dr. Colin Clark, and I'm a senior research fellow at the Soufan Center. The Soufan Center is an independent nonprofit center offering research, analysis, and strategic dialogue on global security challenges and foreign policy issues, with a particular focus on counterterrorism, violent extremism, armed conflict, and the rule of law. In response to rapidly evolving dynamics in Russia's war with Ukraine, our discussion today will explore complex challenges posed by the increasing number of non-state actors engaging in the conflict, to include foreign fighters, volunteers, and mercenaries. Relevant to the discussion today, our team at the Soufan Center is pleased to announce the publication of a new issue brief this week. Will be coming toward the end of the week, on three important dynamics of the developments in Ukraine, particularly the roles of various non-state actors traveling to the battlefield, the narratives and themes propagating online, and the impact of disinformation in the conflict. This issue brief concludes with policy recommendations for policymakers, government officials, and others. We look forward to sharing this brief with you in the coming days. Now we have a really impressive group of speakers who will walk us through the increasingly complex dynamics in the Ukraine-Russia conflict for our discussion today. And please let me introduce them. First, we have Ms. Noreen Chowdhury-Fink, who's the Executive Director of the Soufan Center. She previously served as Senior Policy Advisor on Counterterrorism and Sanctions at the UK mission to the UN, leading representation and negotiations in the Security Council and the General Assembly. Prior to that, Noreen worked in the UN sphere with UN Women and CTED, as well as the Global Center on Cooperative Security and the International Peace Institute. Next, we have Dr. Daniel Byman, who's a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution's Center for Middle East Policy, which he previously led as the center's research director. Dan's also a professor at the Georgetown University Walsh School of Foreign Services Security Studies program. Previously, Dan served as a staff member with the 9/11 Commission and the Joint 9/11 Inquiry Staff of the House and Senate Intelligence Committees, and he's the author of several books on counterterrorism, including state sponsorship of terrorism, conflict and terrorism in the Middle East, more recently books on foreign fighters and the global violent white supremacy extremist movement. Next, Dr. Vera Mironova is a visiting research fellow at Harvard University. She's also a non-resident scholar at the Middle East Institute. Vera has recently been reporting from Ukraine and has focused over much of the past decade on the complexities of radical armed groups and civilians affected by their actions working in conflict zones such as Syria, Iraq, Ukraine, Yemen, DRC, and Myanmar, some of the world's most dangerous places. And if anybody, for all the terrorism scholars on the line that look at field work and field research, we know that Vera has long been a gold standard in this regard. She was embedded with the Iraq Special Operations Forces as they recaptured Mosul from ISIS in 2016, 2017. And last but certainly not least, Ms. Stephanie Foggett is a resident fellow at the Soufan Center. She's also the Director of Global Communications at the Soufan Group. Her work at TSC focuses on multilateral security cooperation, crisis management, and narratives and strategic communications tied to security and counterterrorism. Stephanie previously worked at NATO's Emerging Security Challenges Division. And before we get started, just a few housekeeping issues. The event is public and video will be made available on our website. Also, we'll take some questions from the audience at the end of the event. So if you can, please enter any questions into the Zoom Q&A function, and we will do our best to address them. And I think, in keeping with the style of previous events, rather than have kind of long introductions by each of the speakers, we're going to jump right in to question and answer. I think there's a lot that folks want to know on the line. There's a lot that I'd like to know. And so if possible, I'm going to start with Vera. We'll jump right in and we'll kind of go around the horn. Vera, you recently tweeted that Chechen strongman Ramzan Kadyrov was running low on volunteers to Ukraine. So now he's recruiting Chechens who served time in prison for extremism and terrorism. They're being conditionally released, told to go to fight in Ukraine. There's also anti-Kadyrov Chechens that are working to help these individuals defect. There's a whole lot going on that we're not hearing about, that's not being reported in the press. Can you give us just an overview of what the landscape looks like right now in Ukraine, and unpack some of the most important things? What does it look like right now on the ground?
So talking about like Chechens, if we take them separately, they have like their own a little bit like internal war in there. So we have Chechen Kadyrov forces on Russian side that are absolutely openly saying that they're only under control of Kadyrov himself and are not into control of, whatever the leader of a sector or battalion, somewhere like in Russian army. No, they only do whatever Kadyrov says, and they're very proud of that. This group consists of absolutely like incredible group of people, like just like amusing. So they have people from prison who were conditionally released, and now their condition is to go fight in Mariupol. Then they have some kind of drug addicts. They post pictures, and a lot of friends and family members of people on pictures, they identify themselves and then they tell the whole biography of those people, which is always fun. So we have those guys. The person who is in charge of one of the groups of Kadyrov in Mariupol is a guy who is accused of killing Nemtsov, and who was not prosecuted or even heard in court because he was in Chechnya, and apparently Russian court could not get him in Chechnya.
Just to be clear as well, these are all fighting on the Russian side.
Yes, this is Russian side. Yeah. Then we have two Chechen groups on Ukrainian side. So they're a little bit different. So one is kind of fighting under Ichkeria flag, independent Chechenian state, and the second one is a little bit more on the religious side. So we have two groups like that, and then we have Chechens who are fighting with Ukrainian in Ukrainian units, who just want to be just like normal without any Chechen affiliation. So basically, it makes it like two groups of Chechen on both sides, kind of settling their previous scores. And the interesting thing, why it's in Mariupol, right, not anywhere else? Why those guys, Kadyrov guys, are in Mariupol? Because Mariupol is kind of very far from the front line, so that's why they bring all these like weird people over there, because they could not defect to Ukrainians because it's too far to defect. So if they bring them to the front line, they would be like, "Oh, hello, Ukraine, can I just go home?" But Kadyrov doesn't want that, so they are very far from the front line.
Thank you very much, and I'm going to come back to you to ask a little bit about some of the Westerners in a short while. I want to turn to Dan and first congratulate you on your new book, Spreading Hate, the Global Rise of White Supremacist Terrorism. Most of us can't read books as quickly as Dan writes them, but nevertheless, I can speak for many when I say I'm really looking forward to reading that. Your book prior to that was called Road Warriors, which was about foreign fighters. And my question is Ukraine a conflict where these two topics overlap and intersect, that is the global rise of white supremacist terrorism and foreign fighting? And if so, what ways in particular?
So Colin, first of all, thanks for the kind words, and thank you everyone for having me here. I'm worried that there is an intersection between the white supremacist problem and the foreign fighter movement. Now, what I want to stress is only a relatively small fraction of the people going have links to the white supremacist movement or will have links to it. But when you get a relatively small fraction of a very, very large number, that can still be of concern. And the initial reports, and it's very hard to get ground truth, but the initial reports of people flocking to fight Ukraine suggest lots of people are going. So I am concerned about a small portion of these. And these sorts of conflicts involving lots of foreigners can end up becoming petri dishes for lots of very dangerous behavior, and often dangerous things that we don't anticipate at the time. Let me just name a few sorts of things we've seen in the past. One is that individuals show up for one reason, often, in my eyes at least, an understandable one. And let's say in this case, they're concerned about Russian atrocities and defending innocent Ukrainians. But when they're in the conflict zone, they mix with lots of other people who have very different agendas. So some of them may also have kind of broader, I'll say, humanitarian concerns, but some might have links to violent organizations. Some might have white supremacist ideas. So they're exposed to new ideas. And then related to this, they also become networked. So you might have individuals who are, they go by themselves with a group of friends, but while they're in the conflict zone, they meet other people. And when they leave it, a year later, a month later, whatever it is, they have connections around the world. And that makes them more capable if they're going to turn into violent action. Um, Also, of course, we see people become more dangerous. And part of this is because they receive training. Part of it is simply a Darwinian process where combat, as we're seeing in Ukraine, is brutal. And those who survive, some might just be lucky, but a lot it's because they learned some basic skills and became steady under fire. So people become more competent. And the last one I'll say is mental health, and I don't think that gets the attention it deserves. But a lot of people who come to these conflicts don't have preparation from training or a group of individuals who and a supportive network behind them. And we've of course seen mental health issues in the American military, and here are individuals who, on the whole, are well adjusted and have a large support network. So we're going to see a much greater percentage among people showing up in a combat zone who have no idea what they're getting into, who are all of a sudden exposed to traumatic conflict. And this sort of combination means when people return, they're more networked, they're more capable of using violence. Sometimes they have some mental issues. And in many cases, again, this means nothing. They go back to peaceful lives, or maybe they have some problems, but doesn't show up in political violence. But it's a sort of thing that violent movements and groups can take advantage of. And to me, this is very much something that intelligence agencies and others need to monitor, even if the problem right now is not that great.
Thank you. No, I mean, I speak for probably a lot of folks in our field and those that are likely watching today when I say many of us had these same concerns when this issue first started to flare back up. I mean, even as we looked out at the kind of landscape in 2022, as Russian troops began to mount on the border, this was something that folks were raising concerns about. Let me ask Noreen, because these are conversations that you and I had personally in these early days, and we wrote a piece in Politico, kind of raising the flag on this. We saw Western politicians in some cases endorsing or even encouraging their citizens to travel to Ukraine. You've been very vocal and on the record in writings and briefings saying that states need to begin preparing now. So I guess, Noreen, my question is twofold. What are the primary challenges that might arise? And Dan touched upon some of them. Secondly, what can states legitimately do to address those challenges, beginning now, as many of them should, but likely are not?
Thanks, Colin. And it's great to be here with this fantastic panel having this discussion this morning, because I do think that while we're in the early stages of the conflict, it is good to flag some of these anticipatory challenges. And, I want to second everything that Dan just said. I could actually just stop there and say everything Dan said. That's good. But, one of the things we flagged and we've talked about, our recent foreign fighter experience, or the discussion on foreign fighters, has been certainly the outflow of 40,000 people that travel to Syria and Iraq, right? And let me state for the record, we do not see this as the same issue. We are not talking in large part at this point about a foreign terrorist fighter problem. And certainly there's been a lot of debate about definitions and terminology. And, one thing is clear, that foreign terrorist fighting is illegal since 2014, right? It's only illegal when you go to join a terrorist group. The problem is that when the Security Council adopted some of these counterterrorism measures in 2014 to deal with the foreign terrorist fighter problem, they didn't really clarify what terrorism is. It's not defined, and it wasn't limited to some groups. So some of the challenges we're seeing, in that petri dish that Dan was talking about, I think I'm going to use that term quite a lot. I think that, the risk is that we start seeing a lot of changing motives, a lot of activity where there is overlap and a lack of clarity about where armed conflict and terrorism overlaps, and even a manipulation of that rubric by various parties, which for states, the challenge is when your citizens are going out there and they're not clear about what the legal framework is for volunteering to travel, where they might get entangled with counterterrorism legislation, and how the other side might manipulate that terminology and legislation for when your citizens come back. That is something I think is a very real concern. And it's certainly something new since 2014, since the Security Council adopted these binding resolutions on foreign terrorist fighters, which have, not a lot of clarity about who it applies to and when. But one of the lessons we've learned, even though this is not a foreign terrorist fighter challenge and it's a very different context, is that yes, things get messy and your citizens can get, go abroad and get entangled. The biggest challenge then being what to do on their return and how they return, right? In some cases, we've heard, we've already seen people coming back, either disillusioned, the adventure wasn't so great, the selfie was taken, they're back home. But that means you also end up with, hardened sort of advocates of violence and sort of more battle-hardened individuals saying, when they return, Dan flagged some of the challenges we've talked about: mental health, reintegration, legal support. A really easy thing states could start to think about is making sure that people are screened when they, when they're registering at an embassy. We know some European states are already doing this, but I don't think it's par for the course from what we're hearing. Set up a registry so that states know which of their citizens are already going, and who's out there and why. Think about some of the rehabilitation and reintegration programs that have, that have already been established, and think about how those might apply. And I think very importantly, clarify to your own citizens where counterterrorism legislation applies, what is legal and what is not legal, rather than these kind of very broad statements of support, which are understandable. Actually empower your citizens to stay on the right side of the law.
I think that's some great advice, and I hope that there's some policymakers online right now listening and kind of getting a jump on what is sure to be a pretty immense challenge, and a challenge that I think in terms of duration we're going to be dealing with for a while. This isn't going to be resolved quickly. I don't think the conflict will, and certainly its consequences won't be. There's so many different aspects to what's happening here in Ukraine. One of those is what's happening online and what's happening in Western circles online. So I want to turn to Stephanie, because she looks at a lot of the far-right extremist propaganda. She's an expert on the ecosystem that these individuals kind of make up. And so for Stephanie, I want to ask you, you wrote recently in a War on the Rocks piece about how Putin's far-right fans in the West are reacting to the conflict in Ukraine. What are some of the themes and the narratives that you've seen resonating online, and how are they related to the conflict?
Yeah, thank you for having me. So I think that's a good question. I think to kind of set the stage, it's important to note that the international far right is not a monolith. So their reaction to the conflict has been similarly disparate. Many within the far right do support or are sympathetic to Russian and Vladimir Putin. Some support Ukraine or far-right elements in Ukraine, and there are a good few who are entirely agnostic. They are eschewing the conflict because they like to refer to a concept they frame as brother wars, where when white populations are pitted against each other, that doesn't serve the movement at all. So there really isn't one standard view of the conflict. I'd say one constant is anti-Semitism. Across all of the narratives, regardless of which side or which position they're taking, there is a tremendous amount of anti-Semitism and horrible rhetoric against the Jewish community. Notably, I'd say where I think Russian and far-right narratives are really finding sway is in their shared virulently anti-Western postures. So both Putin and the far right want to challenge the status quo. They both project a narrative that the Western liberal order is the villain, and the grievances they have, be they political, economic, or social, they all emanate from the same place. So, while Putin has distinct reasons for his worldview and he has his own aspirations in Ukraine, he's certainly learned how to court the far right, and I'm talking in the years leading up to this conflict. And he's really been able to tap into the shared disdain they both have for Western style democracy and liberalism. And I'd say on Ukraine specifically, both Russia and the far right, they want to halt the spread of Western-style government across Europe. They both see in Ukraine another country that is embracing democracy, tolerance, and closer bonds with European institutions. So they share this visceral aversion to Ukraine's pivot westward. I think I'll end by saying that, the West is incredibly united right now. Their response has been cohesive and strong. We've seen this economically on sanctions, politically in statements and communiques, and militarily in the backing of NATO and a raft of security responses and measures. Now, in the face of all of this, the Kremlin does need to identify and exploit fault lines in the West, and Putin needs to find areas where he can chip away at the West's resolve, I feel. And I think the, social and cultural issues are going to provide this fault line for Russia. And indeed, they've been exploiting issues of gender, sexuality, and race for years now. So while America's far right shares a common enemy with Russia in the West, it looks to me right now like the Kremlin is trying to ensure that they also share a common language. So for years, we have seen Putin play into the far right's lionizing of traditional values and this hyper-macho authoritarian politics to include sexist and anti-LGBT rhetoric. But I'm seeing a lot of dog whistles right now coming from Russia. So we saw over the weekend Putin's comments on J.K. Rowling about cancel culture. And that really leans into far-right narratives that are prolific, and there's a lot of anti-trans rhetoric in these spaces. Also, the right has felt, victimized by the same financial institutions, tech platforms, media, these elites. So I think, Russia's trying to talk the talk by using things like silencing and deplatforming and cancel culture. So I worry that the far right really presents this proxy, and that the inroads for Russia to kind of test the West's resolve are going to be in these social and cultural spaces that the far right have they've been exploiting, and it's been serving Russia for years.
Thank you. It's a really, I think, deep and nuanced view of some of the issues at play here. And, I think it was former Speaker of the House, Tip O'Neill, who said all politics is local. But in 2022, and certainly for some time, I'd say the corollary is that all conflict is global, and we can never really separate these issues, right? We're fighting the culture wars here in the States, and somehow the Russian far right is part of this. So it's hard to disentangle. Vera, if I can ask you a little bit about I'm going to ask you about kind of two different groups of foreign fighters in the conflict. One is Westerners in general, but if you want to speak to Americans in particular, and some of those folks, and then the other kind of polar opposite would be some of the Belarusians, Georgians, and others, the more kind of hardcore folks that are there to actually fight. Can you give us a sense of the juxtaposition between those two entities? And as Stephanie talked about, the global far right is far from a monolith. Maybe you can expose some of the myths on American foreign fighters. Are there divisions within those that come to Ukraine to fight on the American side?
Basically, in terms of all foreign fighters coming to Ukraine right now, we divide them on people with experience and people without experience. So people with experience who actually know what they came to do and they know how to do it, and people without experience who just came. So people with experience, majority of them are Russian speaking. So it's Belarusian. It's three battalion of Georgians. They are on the front line. They are really fighting, but there are also Americans there. There are Westerners among those people. Yes.
And to clarify for those following along, the Belarusians that you mentioned, the Georgians, are fighting on the Ukrainian side.
On Ukrainian.
Another Russian speaking.
Yes. So they are fighting on the Ukrainian side, and there are Westerners who also came with military experience, and they're right now on the front line. Not many, but they are. On the other side, majority of Westerners are actually without experience, or they are with experience, but they're still not on a front line, but they are basically very far very close to border with Poland. They're in Lviv, and they are either in international battalion, which is basically an organized group of them, or individually providing some kind of trainings to someone, or medical help and so on. But they are not on the front line, like not even close to the front line. And there are a lot of those people in Lviv. They are so there's so many that they already like have kind of divisions between themselves. So I know that if we're talking about Americans, there are already conflicts between different groups of them. And they also have I'm not sure about, their white supremacist connection or something, but like they have very different political views. So for example, it's well known in Ukraine that Westerners and Americans who are like pro-vaccination, they go through Poland, and people who are against vaccination, they go through Hungary. So like immediately you kind of could figure out where on the US like political spectrum they are just by asking them, where did you cross into Ukraine? So that's how many they are. They already have those divisions.
Foreign fighting in the age of a pandemic. Who thought that the vax no vax issue would spill over into a foreign conflict zone? It's pretty fascinating to think that foreign fighters are self-separating according to whether they're pro-Trump and anti-vaccine versus it's mind-boggling to me. Can you speak a little bit before I go back to Dan on Europeans in general, kind of Western Europeans that you're seeing trickle in? We hear a lot about people mobilizing, and we see anecdotes and things on Twitter, but is there a sense of, is this a real groundswell? Are these folks a force multiplier, or are they really kind of not going to make a difference?
I don't think those folks make any difference. So first of all, they're all behind, especially right now, like they're all somewhere near Lviv. They're not on the front line. They don't have experience. So it's going to take them at least a month to train them. Ukraine does not have a shortage of manpower to go on the front line at all. Like you need to bribe to get into the army, like because their line is huge. So they just, in terms of PR purposes, I mean, great. It shows that like the whole world is behind us. And I know that our Russian side is very pissed about it. I'm also in contact with some Russian military. And when the information about international battalion came up, and they were like, oh my God, like it's terrible. Like they were really pissed. But in terms of, and plus don't forget that Ukrainians understand that those people who come in there, they're very weird. Some of them are extremely weird. So I know that from international battalions, some people were already kicked out for mental health. So like, yeah, so they were like literally kicked out. And I think, and I met like hundreds of them. So I think many more would be kicked out soon for one reason or another. So I really don't think that majority of them is going to make it ever anywhere close to the front line.
Fascinating, although they do tend to absorb quite a bit of the media attention, especially in the US. Dan, if I could turn to you, you've written extensively about the role of Russia and the far right in a really excellent article on survival with Shelby Butt. You write that Russia also directly supports numerous far right groups in Europe and the United States. Taking a step back, what does the broader support network look like in terms of Moscow's interaction with transnational far right extremism? And how do you see the current conflict in Ukraine altering that trajectory, if at all?
So this is one of those topics where there's a lot of anecdotes, a lot of smoke, but it's very hard, at least for me, to get a sense of the specifics and the scale of support before the conflict. So on both sides, we've seen a range of actors. So in the Russian case, there have been some reports of Russian intelligence directly involved in trying to at least organize or meet with some of the different right-wing extremist actors, especially in Europe. But more commonly, it's been through different organizations within Russia, whether groups like the Russian Imperial Movement or simply organizations that have linked to different wealthy and powerful people in Russia who have ties to Putin. And there are people like Mira on this call who know far more about Russia than I do, but my sense from colleagues who have expertise in this area is they would never be allowed to operate if what they were doing was contrary to what Putin and the Russian state wanted. So this activity may not be official government policy, but tolerating the activity and in a de facto way supporting it is. And we've seen these Russian actors give some degree of funding, but also especially training and organization to, again, a range of actors. So we've seen street gangs and bike gangs in parts of Central Europe receive support. In Sweden, there were attacks on refugees that were done by people who were trained in Russia. We have ties and financial ties even to political parties in Europe that represent the far right. And of course, we saw in some of the investigations, Russian support and financial support to things like the NRA in the United States. And what Russia has done historically is tried to sow division. And so they've also placed bets on some far left figures. Many people may remember that presidential candidate Jill Stein was someone who was also receiving Russian support. And so this method of trying to support both ends against the middle is something they do by supporting an array of actors on the extremes, and also something they pushed in social media narratives. And this is something that's kind of ineffable, but when you have a lot of incitement, there's a real question about, is it 1 in 1,000, 1 in a million? That person picks up a gun. And it's hard to draw a direct line between the piece of propaganda and the actual violence. But when you have a lot of propaganda, it increases the odds that someone will act in the name of the propaganda. So how will Ukraine, the latest conflict, change all this? So one thing that at least I'm hoping is that it'll be shining a spotlight on a lot of this, that you'll have a lot of local investigations into ties to Russia just for counterintelligence concerns. You'll have more media investigations into this, that the back and forth of money and people will become much harder as there are restrictions and a lot more monitoring of travel. So I'm hoping we'll see less of it. It'll become more in the light. And also I think it's changed politically. Again, Colin, that you and, excuse me, you and your colleagues have written on the subject, but the perception of Russia and how, Russia and Putin were kind of admired by many in the far right in the United States and Europe, the Ukraine conflict is changing that. And so my hope is that there'll be a little less naivete, a little less admiration and hero worship, along with a lot of practical measures that will make this harder.
Great point. And I think, a lot of it's apparent when we turn on mainstream media like Fox News and see Tucker Carlson kind of parroting some of the far right's talking points, or even doing shows from Hungary. I don't think there's even an attempt to disguise anymore what's going on and the influence that has over millions of Americans. Noreen, I wanted to ask you about, you wrote an excellent piece for CNN just recently, and you noted the importance of previous UN Security Council resolutions from 2014 and 2017, respectively, and how those established certain precedents. And I'm wondering how those are related to what we're seeing today in Ukraine. I mean, you touched upon it a little bit before, talking about making foreign fighting illegal, but also the distinction between having to join an official terrorist organization and the paradox of, still in many spheres, we're having this debate about what is terrorism. So how do those, what we've done in the fight against ISIS and the lead up to the Islamic State, are any of those measures relevant? What do we need to do to kind of, get up to speed to where we are today and start taking this threat seriously?
Thanks, Colin. I think that, one of the important points about that is in 2014, when there was sort of the peak of the outflow of fighters and individuals traveling to join ISIS, the Security Council adopted a universally binding resolution that talked about the need for states to prohibit travel for foreign terrorist fighters and disrupting foreign terrorist fighters from sort of perpetrating terrorist acts and supporting terrorist groups. And then in 2017, there was another binding, both of them US spearheaded resolution to deal with returnees. What's important about these is that they create obligations for states to then adopt in their own domestic legislation certain types of measures. And we know a number of states have, again, domesticated these resolutions by creating their own counterterrorism legal frameworks. The challenge is, of course, we don't have as I mentioned, a universally accepted definition of terrorism. We've seen a number of countries that have taken sort of these Security Council frameworks and actually use them to then abuse their own citizens or use counterterrorism legislation to then oppress dissidents and perpetrate human rights violations. So the challenge is that you have these resolutions out there, you have an obligation for states to implement, many of whom have, as I mentioned earlier, a number of new counterterrorism laws and measures that are aiming at, foreign terrorist fighters without actually clarifying what foreign terrorist fighters are and who exactly is a terrorist group. The UN has only designated Al-Qaeda and ISIS as they're the only two internationally recognized terrorist groups. But you asked an important question about precedent, and I think with many eyes on the Security Council and questions about sort of its value added, it's an important point because counterterrorism is the only point, I think, for about 2 decades where the permanent members have had some level of consensus. Even in the midst of Syria and all the other humanitarian and political crises, the permanent members were able in large part to agree on certain basics of counterterrorism. And for that reason, we'd seen like a lot of international counterterrorism activity. I think with the breakdown in relations, certainly with Russia and China and some of the dynamics between the permanent members, it raises real questions about whether that precedent of cooperation on CT, whether, one thing we could all agree on was terrorists bad. We didn't always agree on how they were to be addressed. That's the challenge. So I think that precedent of consensus is not something we're going to see going forward, which raises very important questions about how we manage international cooperation when you end up with a transnationalized challenge.
Thank you. No, there's a ton there to unpack, and we'll actually, as you know, as one of the co-authors, we'll be dealing with a lot of this in our forthcoming issue brief. So for those that are looking to get some really deep and incisive background on these topics, we'll be releasing that through the Soufan Center later this week. I want to turn to Stephanie, and we're getting closer to the point where I'll be taking questions from the virtual audience. But before we do, I want to ask Stephanie, for folks that don't spend a lot of time online tracking far-right narratives, what might surprise them to learn about some of the things that you see regularly? Because there's not a lot of people that are in there doing the so-called dirty work and kind of looking at how these narratives emerge, evolve, resonate, other ones that fade away. What should we know? What are some interesting kind of takeaways or things that are counterintuitive or just straight up fascinating about some of the things that you're seeing?
Yeah, another good question. Let's see. I think when it comes to the far right, there's a lot of focus on the overt hate and the violence, the kind of anger, the rage, the bravado. That does get a lot of attention, but there are areas that get less coverage. I mean, as you know, I do like to focus on gender dynamics, and I like to look at the far right with that lens, and I think there's a lot we can learn from that. So the far right and white supremacy ecosystem, it's rife with sexist, misogynistic, and anti-LGBTQ+ rhetoric. And Putin has really played into these feelings through his sexist rhetoric and his carefully cultivated kind of macho imagery that's played into the hands of white supremacists for years. And you'll see this in this kind of content of, they might show these kind of macho Russian soldiers training with bears, and then they'll compare it to Western soldiers talking about feelings and inclusion. So
hasn't done them a lot of good in Ukraine, all the bear training, I'll tell you that.
Exactly. And that really comes to my point that before this war, a really common talking point among white supremacists and the far right was how the US military and Western militaries were being destroyed by diversity, how in meeting the needs of women, minorities, the LGBTQ+ community, Western militaries were lowering standards. They were, limiting fighting fitness. That Russia was training real men, while we talk about inclusion. And now we've seen, I think we've seen that isn't the case. They were kind of hoping that the ranks of wokeness would be owned by Russia. But what we've really seen is that proper training, including reaching NATO standards, rules, procedures, promoting civilian control of the armed forces. These are really paying dividends in Ukraine. And you can contrast that with Russia's poor performance and low morale amongst soldiers. And, you know, I think this is a cause for concern that even amongst the mainstream, there have been mainstream media and political figures who have, you know, criticized the US military for being too woke. But, you know, for years, the far right has been rooting for this hyper kind of macho Russian war machine. And I think this is a really good opportunity to put that myth to bed. And I think the crux, when you kind of look at this from the angle that I've been trying to think about it, is that both the far right and Vladimir Putin, they push this narrative that the future is behind us. They celebrate past glories. The far right is obsessed with history and tradition and getting back to the way things were, the way things should be as they were in the past. And Putin does this too. He has a view that Russia needs to go back to the way things were, that Russia's faced humiliation and all of these things. So what both Putin and the far right really share is a type of status change anxiety about their place in the modern world. And they really lean into narratives that they're really being humiliated and undermined. They look backwards. But, we should really be pushing and showing, the importance of these narratives that look forward and that show that, having this kind of forward and future thinking posture is really good. And I think, there is an opportunity to really counter some of those narratives right now with what we're seeing in Ukraine.
There's a lot there. I mean, a lot of richness in what you just said. The status change really kind of sticks with me because, a lot of scholars after January 6th looked at what motivated people, right? And we've seen some of the work by Bob Pape and others that talked about fear of status change and losing out to immigrants, socioeconomic issues as well, which dovetail with the far right narratives. We've also had a lot of U.S. politicians salivating over Russian military videos, and not only is that embarrassing just in and of itself, but I think it's even more mortifying. Well, first of all, I mean, as an American politician, really just denigrating our own military as woke. One of my favorite memes that I've seen has been the woke U.S. military tank that's with the rainbow flag, and then the Russian macho tank that's destroyed on the battlefield in Ukraine. Pretty interesting juxtaposition. I want to turn to questions from our virtual audience, and I have one for Vera here that's really interesting. And the question is, what do you foresee may happen with the weapons that the Ukrainian government is giving to foreign volunteers? Will this become a regional problem in terms of, who keeps track of these weapons? Where do they go next? Or are they potentially falling into the hands of some bad hombres?
I think it's a very good question, but in terms of foreign fighters, let's separate just in general arms trade that, Ukraine is very big in, and especially like black market arms trade. But in terms of foreign fighters, I'm not worried about it. So first of all, like I met like 100 foreign fighters in Lviv, and none of them had any weapon, period. It's safer not to give them weapons, when they just arrive. So, there's no one to fight there either. So it's fine. But I don't think those weapons in the hands of foreign fighters are going to ever leave Ukraine. No, I'm not worried about it at all. They're actually complaining about not getting weapons. So. But in terms of, in general, black market weapon trade, I think it could be potentially a problem because we know that Ukraine was big in it, but not right now. Right now, like there's not enough weapons in Ukraine.
Interesting. Well, I think that's an issue to keep a close eye on, especially given the sophisticated weaponry that's floating around the battlefield. And we've seen with other conflicts in the past, like in the Balkans, some of these places turns into an arms bazaar. And so there's going to be, I think, close international community overwatch, or hopefully on what's happening here. I have a question on the Wagner Group for Dan, and we'll be actually talking quite a bit about Wagner in our forthcoming analysis. But the question is, are there other Russian private military companies besides Wagner fighting in Ukraine? If so, how do we see Wagner and these groups being supported by the Russian Ministry of Defense? And I'll just, that I've seen in maybe the last week or two, a lot of reporting that Wagner guys are being relocated from foreign battlefields to Ukraine to serve as a force multiplier. But anything you can tell us kind of on Wagner that illuminates the role that they're likely to play in this conflict in Ukraine?
So I'll speak briefly, Colin, and I'd love if you chimed in, and also I'm sure Vera and others have more to say on this than I do. But Wagner was, as everyone on this call probably knows, a somewhat, if you will, expeditionary and semi-private military company, but also with extensive ties to the state. So they were never operating in places where the Putin regime didn't want them to operate. So it's not surprising that in a time of relative desperation, many are being recalled to fight in Ukraine, where Russia, in contrast to Ukraine, actually has manpower issues, and in particular has huge problems with skilled manpower, in that there are, people often say elite units. I think that's misleading, but I would say they're better units and they're more specialized units, have actually borne much of the brunt of the fighting and have taken extremely significant casualties. So to have people come who have experience in urban warfare, who are proven fighters, is very valuable. There'll be questions about integration. That this is a large scale conventional military operation, and there are many things we could say about Russian military performance, but one of the many problems they've had is doing integrated military operations, doing combined arms, actually fighting beyond relatively small units, and having a bunch of people from Wagner is actually not going to help that problem. So there will be skilled people, they need skilled people, they will do some benefit, but I'm skeptical this is going to make a substantial difference at either an operational or strategic level, though I can imagine in a particular battle, having some of these people in the fight would help Russia.
Yeah, and I've observed much of the same, with combined arms, some of the challenges there, clear logistics challenges, clear challenges with command and control, lines of communication, and others that I think they obviously underestimated Ukrainian capabilities on that front, and they're paying for it dearly. I have a question from Jeff Selden from Voice of America. And this is for anyone that wants to answer, but maybe Noreen, if we can start with you. And he asks, to what extent do you see both pro-Ukrainian and pro-Russian fascist groups trying to take advantage of the flow of foreign fighters to Ukraine? To what extent has the Ukrainian government mitigated this problem? So we know there's been a lot of ink spilled over the Azov battalion, the Azov regiment, the Azov movement, et cetera, back in 2014. Is that something that is as concerning today, given some of the steps that the Ukrainian government has reportedly taken in kind of attempting to marginalize the far-right element within its own ranks?
Thanks. I can take a shot at it. I'm sure others have some really important points. I think I'll start with the mitigation question. I think the step of establishing, at least nominally, an official registration process through the Ukrainian embassies, the step of addressing and creating this official foreign legion, I think was a really important mitigation measure, at least, at the outset, because it sets some effort at command and control and in terms of regularizing those coming in, right? And I think legally speaking, that's a really important distinguishing factor, particularly as we were talking about some of the confusion with terrorist groups and all that. So I think the Ukrainian government's mitigation measures, at the outset have been quite important. We certainly see all sides trying to take advantage of the flow of foreign fighters, whether operationally, and others have spoken to, the varied operational benefits of some of those coming in, but certainly the PR benefit. And Vera alluded to this, but certainly on the Western side, we see a lot of sort of heroism and glory and sympathy and support associated with the foreign fighters. And I think that's been a really important role for that. And I think that, we see less a little bit about certainly the pro-Russian side here. I think just one point I want to add, and others may come in with other issues, is that we also have to be a little careful about the information bubble in the West. You know, when we were talking about Wagner, and when you look, for example, at like some of the votes in the UN, right? The countries that didn't always side with the West or didn't, you know, support Ukraine were countries where Wagner is very present, where Russia has invested a lot of efforts. And in a lot of parts of the world, people will see this not just as a Russia-Ukraine fight, but, you know, whether they have, you know, whether they're angry at the US, whether they see it as an anti-Western sentiment, you know, we just have to be careful in terms of how we divide the sort of pro-Russian, pro-Ukraine sides when we think of a global audience. I think that there's a risk to staying in our bubble and assuming that everyone is on one side or the other for understandable reasons. The global audience, I think, is far more mixed. And just, you know, as we're talking about the movement of these groups, when Wagner is moving people from other parts of the world into Ukraine, we also have to ask what's going to happen in those parts of the world. So if a country like Mali is depending on Wagner, for example, and Wagner is redeploying to Ukraine, what happens there? I think those are some trends we need to look. And so, so I think certainly both sides will take advantage of the flow of foreign fighters, but how the global audience sees it and what's motivating the sort of dynamic, I think, is something we need to keep tracking.
That's a great point, especially the power vacuums left behind when Wagner redeploys elsewhere, and what happens with, you know, places like Mali and Mozambique and Libya and elsewhere where they might be. And if anyone else wants to chime in on that, feel free. Otherwise, I can go to the next question. All right, let me turn to one more from the audience, and I'll pose this one to Stephanie. This is from Ryan Bauer, who says, thank you to all the presenters. Given some of the varying views about the war in far-right extremist communities, do you have a sense about how the war is impacting how the religious right in the West views Putin as a religious conservative icon? Super interesting question.
Yeah, that is an interesting question. I would say that, Putin and the Kremlin, they've done a really good job of just appealing to a range of forces in the West. So, you know, for people who lean into, sexist and anti-LGBTQ plus narratives, he's positioned himself as the defender of this. He's gonna, keep these forces of degeneracy from, spreading, further west, and he's the champion of that. So I do think there is a religious role to this. Many in the far right, they do a lot of the rhetoric is, anti-Semitic, Islamophobic. They're against tolerance and diversity, and there is, a strand that Putin has kind of positioned himself as this leader of traditional values, that the church is important in Russia. It's a part of their tradition, and I worry that, again, people will project the anxieties that they have about where they presently are, and that, Putin, he can craft a narrative to kind of play into those. So again, I think, Dr. Byman said at the beginning, it's really important to kind of monitor what they're saying and to make sure that we're responding. And I think that's, that's going to be something we have to continue to do.
Thank you, and all good points. There's a question from Matthew Ween, and I'll start with Vera, but I think others will want to weigh in on the same question as we approach kind of the end of our webinar here. And this is an interesting one. He says, with so many foreign fighters stalled in Western Ukraine, will they become frustrated and seek to leave their holding pattern in Lviv and join extremist groups? Vera, we'll start with you. And I know we don't know the answer. There could be some speculation there.
It's a very important and a very interesting question that a lot of people are very worried about. So yeah, they're all absolutely totally frustrated with what's going on. Westerners who are stuck in Lviv, but would they join some kind of right sector or Azov? First of all, I don't think it's physically possible for them. Like, it's extremely hard. They don't speak Russian. They don't speak Ukrainian. So they don't have a way. So right now, like Right Sector Azov does not recruit this actively. They don't have their English language representative to do so. So technically, even if they want, let's assume they do, it's very unlikely right now, just simply by network. And also don't forget that, like, even Azov and like Right Sector, they still operate in a framework of Ukraine government, more or less. So they're not absolutely, by themselves.
How about other
So-
groups in Europe? Do you think maybe they go back to countries of origin and try to get something going there since they have had little success in gaining traction in Ukraine?
Well, they could do, I mean, they could think and dream about whatever, but if they came to Ukraine and failed to do anything in Ukraine, would they be successful trying to do something back home? Well, I don't think so. So, and a lot of people I met are really, really off. Like, we had a foreign fighter who got lost on a border. Like, he was not able to cross the border. It's a normal border. You take bus from Poland to Lviv, and he failed to do it. We were asked to go and like rescue him from the border, and he wanted to fight someone somewhere.
Maybe he's in
So-
charge of Russia's logistics.
Definitely. And then he mixed up the borders a little bit. Yeah, that could happen, but I'm really not worried about those kinds of people. Like,
Dan, any comments? Do you want to weigh in on that? Do you think, I know you've written on frustrated foreign fighters before, but that's in a different sense. That's where they were prevented from leaving their countries of origin because of newly enacted laws.
So I'll say two things. One is to echo Vera's point, which is this in Ukraine, it's not a case where there are kind of vast areas of chaos where you have marauding groups going back and forth, as has been true in places like Somalia or Afghanistan in the past. There are front lines. And on the Ukrainian side, there's a government that's exercising a degree of administrative and military control. And of course, it's not perfect, but it's not the sort of thing where individuals are simply able to kind of float around. But I really want to emphasize your point about the limited capacity of many of these people. Now, there are some skilled people with military skills and otherwise can contribute to the fight. But you have huge numbers of people, at least anecdotally, who seem to be enthusiastic but not offer much. And this is something that we've seen again and again in previous conflicts. And these people tend to create more problems than they offer benefits, right? They use up training resources, they use up supplies, they're gung-ho and they do stupid things if they ever get to the battlefield. And many of them are fundamentally unfit to be in a war zone. I think certainly some of my fellow panelists have read Omar Hamami's memoirs of fighting in Somalia. And a lot of what he talks about is just the unrealistic expectations of a lot of volunteers, where people show up and, in the jihadist case, they're wondering where the angels are who are supposed to be fighting on their side. They're not used to living in, the discomforts of not having a meal or having to kind of sleep out in the cold. And so you're going to have large numbers of people who have a very low capacity. And I think many of them will simply go home and be discouraged. But you have to worry about the ones that kind of stick around and become twisted by the whole thing.
Thank you. Yeah, and also some great points. Maybe those angels also got lost on the border and never made it to the battlefield. I honestly wish we had another hour to go through these questions and talk. Really, really informative conversation this morning. So on behalf of the Soufan Center, I just want to thank our panelists. I want to thank all those who attended virtually for this wonderful discussion. And I hope you will continue to look to our work. Again, we'll have an issue brief out later this week on this topic. We look forward to sharing that with you, and we look forward to keeping in touch. So thank you to everybody. And that'll be it. So thanks so much. Take care.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.